On a cold December day in 1972, in an area of waste ground alongside the then Lehrter Railway station in West Berlin, construction workers made a gruesome discovery. Buried several feet down were the bodies of two men, two of the many missing who had last been seen in the final brutal hours of the battle for Berlin. But just who were they? Could they have been amongst the key Nazis of the Third Reich? And how did they end up at this spot? In this video, we'll use the latest technology, veteran testimony, wartime aerial imagery and this remarkable colour footage to investigate a decades-long mystery and follow the fortunes of Hitler's closest surviving confidants in their desperate attempts to escape the Führerbunker. To get an idea of just how difficult that task would be, we need to take a look at the situation as it stood at the end of April 1945. After the death of Hitler on the afternoon of the 30th of April, alongside his wife of 36 hours, Eva Braun, the Soviets had already surrounded Berlin and had begun to drive inwards towards the heart of the city. By overlaying these aerial photos taken in early 1945 and blending them onto the modern map of Berlin, we can reveal the city as it looked at the time. The German defenders had fought stubbornly in the final days, especially in this area, designated the Z or Zentrum defensive zone, the area which contained all of the best known and most significant buildings and streets. The Arnholzer station, Hermann Göring's enormous air ministry, the Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, the old and new Reichschancelleries, beneath which in this precise location was to be found the Führerbunker and the famous Unter den Linden, along which was found the Adolf Hotel, the iconic Brandenburg Gate, and finally here, across the corner of the Tiergarten Park, was the Reichstag, the capture of which had been designated as the key objective to symbolise Soviet victory in the battle for Berlin. By the time Hitler's body went up in flames just here late on the 30th of April, the Russian juggernaut was just a few hundred metres away. In the north, the Reichstag was still in German hands, but only just, with Soviets installed here, crucially covering the key crossing points across the Spree River. In the west, the Tiergarten had seen bitter fighting was now predominantly in Soviet hands. To the south, the Landwehr Canal had been breached after brutal fighting, and the attackers were progressing house by house through the city streets. And in the east, Berlin Cathedral and parts of the Unter den Linden were also in Soviet control. In short, the survivors in the Führerbunker were in deep trouble. In fact, their options were severely limited. The only real chance to escape the city was believed to lie to the north, where German forces were still fighting. But to get there meant passing through the Soviet lines via only a few isolated buildings, acting as islands in a sea of more than 2 million Soviet troops. But as long as there was even a glimmer of hope of avoiding the dreaded Soviet captivity, the defenders would try to escape. And to be fair, the remaining Germans in Berlin had good reason to be concerned. After years of bloody warfare on the Eastern Front, marked by horrific war crimes, genocide and mass murder, the advancing Soviets were in no way inclined to leniency. That Soviet rage was most firmly aimed at the surviving Nazi leadership and Hitler's closest aides. At the top of that wanted list, following the death of Joseph Goebbels, was Martin Bormann. Born in Wegelben, modern-day Saxony in 1900, Bormann was a long-standing member of the Nazi Party, having joined back in 1922, and with a mixture of ruthlessness and manipulation had worked his way up the party ranks until in 1943 he became Adolf Hitler's private secretary. It was in this role that he continued to gain power and considerable animosity by controlling access to the Führer. Intensely disliked by Himmler, Göring and Goebbels, Bormann was said by many to be the real power holder after Hitler himself. But with his chief's death, his position had become incredibly precarious, and despite being promoted to party minister, he was desperate to escape Berlin and reach Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz before his enemies could move against him. Also in the bunker was this man, 32-year-old Arthur Axmann. Born in Westphalia but raised in Berlin, Axmann was also a die-hard Nazi. Seeing combat on the Eastern Front during Operation Barbarossa, he was badly wounded and lost his right arm. Returning to Berlin and Nazi Party politics, his star continued to rise, and he was by 1945 leader of the Hitler Youth movement, and as such held considerable power. They were not alone amongst Hitler's inner circle to be trapped in the bunker. Also, there were a number of senior generals, including Generals Krebs and Burgdorf, Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller, Brigade Führerbunker, and Werner Naumann, the newly promoted Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Amongst the less senior personnel, but still within Hitler's closest entourage, were Otto Gunscher, his SS adjutant, Heinz Linge, his valet, long-standing driver Erich Kempka, his pilot Hans Bauer, and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, his personal physician, all of whom were now faced with the same choice of surrender or attempting an escape. Most would choose the latter. But how to do it? As we see from this American aerial footage from July 1945, above ground Berlin was at that time a wasteland of ruins, but on the 1st of May was also crawling with Soviet tanks and infantry. That left only one real option: the underground railways. The network of Berlin U-Bahn stations, running today exactly as it did in 1945, allowed someone with good knowledge and a large slice of luck to traverse much of the centre of the city below ground. Let's take a closer look. The planned escape, to be launched under cover of darkness on the evening of the 1st of May, a full 36 hours after Hitler's death, meant that the fugitives, split into approximately 6 but perhaps as many as 10 groups, ranging from a few men to several dozen, would leave by the area of the new Reichschancellery at set intervals shortly after a spearhead force led by Brigade Führer Munker, with the following groups aiming for the nearby entrance to the Kaiserhof U-Bahn station, today Mohrenstrasse, from which they would head to Stadtmitte before turning due northwards to Friedrichstrasse station along the underground rail lines to emerge at street level and use the route created by Munker across the Spree River here at the Wiedendamme Bridge, before heading in their groups northwestwards to reach friendly forces. By 9:15 p.m, the escapers were ready and massed just here in the ground floor of the now demolished Reichschancellery, with most senior leaders, Bormann included, having changed their prominent uniform and insignia for either regular Wehrmacht uniform or civilian attire. Though Bormann was also carrying Hitler's personal testament with a specific order to make it to Dönitz in Schleswig-Holstein. Other men chose not to, or were unable to leave. Among them were General Krebs, Burgdorf, perhaps Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller, and the wounded commander of Hitler's SS Bodyguard. Records differ, but it was probably shortly before 9:15 p.m. that the first group of fugitives, led by Munker, headed into the Berlin night. Minutes later, the following groups, including Bauer, Bormann, Hitler's female secretaries, and Axmann, followed suit. Bauer described their movements. There were about 15 of us in our group, and we went out of the Vossstrasse entrance where the SA guards had always stood, and from there we ran towards the Kaiserhof underground station. It had been badly damaged and there were no steps left, so we went down into the station on our behinds. Apart from where bombs and shells had broken upon the tunnel, it was quite dark. Again, and understandably given the situation, records are unclear, but it seems at least that Bauer and Bormann's group missed the northwards turning for Friedrichstrasse at Stadtmitte, instead reaching Gendarmenmarkt station. Emerging to a sea of flame and shellfire, they quickly retraced their steps, eventually finding their way to this point on Friedrichstrasse, just south of the Wiedendamme Bridge. The time lost, though, had been crucial, as Munker's spearhead had by this time found a separate route, apparently via an iron footbridge across the Spree somewhere in this area, and had reached the Charité hospital complex, where they paused to wait for the others who would never arrive. Back with Bauer, the situation soon became clear. From the number of burning German vehicles of all kinds around the Wiedendamme Bridge on Friedrichstrasse, the Soviets clearly had a strong position nearby. This was confirmed a few moments later when a heavily manned roadblock was seen on the northern end of the bridge. In fact, a small glimpse of the carnage in this area can be found through the images of Soviet photographer Mark Redkin, who on the 4th of May captured these scenes of a knocked-out German assault gun, half-tracks, lorries, cars, and even a horse and cart around the roadblock. Clearly, with no way forward on foot, the group withdrew to this spot right here, a courtyard at Admiralspalast, which today still exists, at which time they were joined by a number of others from the later escape groups, including Heinz Linge and Erich Kempka, minus those who had perhaps wisely decided to make themselves scarce along the route. The stroke of fortune did apparently follow though, when according to multiple sources, a King Tiger tank from the SS Nordland division, surely one of the very last in the city, turned up along with several other armoured vehicles. Linge recalled the next moments. Bormann decided to break through the Russian lines using a panzer, so Kempka jumped up, stopped the vehicles and told the leading panzer commander what was required. Under the protection of this panzer, heading for the tank barrier, Bormann, Naumann and Stumpfegger doubled forward while I watched. The panzer was hit by a projectile from a Panzerfaust. The people alongside it were tossed into the air like dolls by the explosion. I could no longer see Stumpfegger nor Bormann. The tank was apparently hit right here by the junction of Wieglerstrasse, though does seem to have fought on, eventually being abandoned here at the end of the road. Believing those around the tank to have all been killed or captured, Linge, along with about 20 others, including Führerbunker telegraphist Erich Misch, descended into a nearby tramway tunnel which eventually led them to Seestrasse U-Bahn station, where he and the few survivors' escape attempt would come to an end. Symbolic of the confusion that reigned at that time, Misch actually believed that they'd made it as far as the Stettiner station, though the manner of capture described by both agrees. Here's Misch. After a few hundred meters more, we reached a spot where the tunnel roof had been penetrated by a bomb. The Russians were above the hole, tossing down hand grenades every couple of seconds. These exploded with a tremendous noise. We attempted to estimate the distance in time between each, and then sprinted for it. One of the grenadiers suddenly put a finger to his lips. Germans. We listened. We heard German voices. One of the grenadiers cautiously reconnoitred the street through the bars of the shaft. "Man, they're our people," he called out. I was the last but one to climb up. Only Linge was behind me. A moment later, I had scarcely raised my head than I felt a rifle butt poke me in the back. We were in the hands of the Russians. Back at the Widendammer Bridge, seen here as it looked in 1943 before Allied bombs and artillery had wrecked the area, Bormann and Dr. Stumpfegger, both stunned from the explosion of the tank, Axmann, who was wounded in the same moment, and Naumann were amazingly still alive, as were both Erich Kempka and pilot Bauer. Under constant heavy gunfire and in a ruined city, cohesion was lost. Kempka set out alone, eventually taking shelter with a group of Yugoslavian women refugees under a nearby railway bridge. Bauer was less fortunate. Advancing along the Spree River's north bank, he was driven further northwards by fire from around the Reichstag and eventually wounded in both legs and chest by Soviet submachine gunners near the Charité Hospital, where Monka had gone to ground some time earlier. Captured and eventually losing a leg, Bauer would endure a decade of brutal incarceration in the Soviet Union. Monka himself had left by the time Bauer reached the Charity, and along with a handful of men and Hitler's secretaries, he pushed on northwestwards, eventually being surrounded in an air raid shelter next to a brewery on Schornhauser Allee. He would surrender the following day and spend 6 years in solitary confinement at the hands of the NKVD. He died in 2001, aged 90. Prior to that event, and back at the Widendammer Bridge, one small group, that of Bormann, Dr. Stumpfegger, Axmann and his adjutant Günther Welzin, continued on. Unable to advance beyond the Widendammer Bridge, they instead returned along this route to the overground or S-Bahn line at Friedrichstrasse station, where they climbed onto the now deserted tracks and began to move northwest toward the Lehrter Bahnhof, their route being visible here. Now, in the years since the end of the war, much has changed in this area, the most obvious thing being the demolition of the large Lehrter station, replaced with Berlin's main station, the Hauptbahnhof, but with the aid of an American aerial colour footage we can reconstruct it. In this slowed down shot we see the approach to the Lehrter station, with the raised tracks crossing the Humboldthaven harbour basin. It was along these that Bormann's group had moved, towards the Lehrter, the burnt out shell of which is still visible on the screen. By pausing, we can see the northwards running tracks out of the station, over which a road bridge, part of the Invalidenstrasse, crosses. Difficult to identify but certainly present is a set of steps at Friedrichslifthofer, approximately here, allowing anyone on the tracks to return to ground level. As we continue around, we see Invalidenstrasse running eastwards to a second small bridge several hundred metres away. In the other direction, westwards, but off-screen, is Altmorbid with another station. As the camera continues to orbit the Lehrter, we get a clear view back southeastwards towards the city, with the winding river Spree in view and again the rail tracks coming from the Friedrichstrasse station. Eyewitness testimony from this point comes exclusively from Arthur Axmann, who was interviewed in detail on the 7th and 9th of January 1948 in US custody. Here's his word-for-word interview transcript covering exactly what he claims happened over the next few minutes, paired up with both modern and historic city views to understand the situation. Now give us again just what happened now we've established the time. I scrambled out of this bomb crater where I had taken shelter, and Bormann, State Secretary Naumann and Dr. Stumpfegger and I went along the railway track towards Friedrichstrasse and Lehrter station. It was there we left the railway track again. We were intercepted there by Russians. Bormann ran on, whereas I stayed and talked to the Russians. Were you in uniform? Yes, but without my rank insignia. Didn't they immediately take you prisoner? No. How do you explain that? I told them I was a member of the Volkssturm, a sort of home guard that was organised in the last month of the war, that as far as I was concerned the war was over and I was on my way home. And they apparently accepted this? Yes, all the more so as I had a wooden arm. Oh, I see. Then where did you go? I walked on in the direction of Altmorbid, whereas Bormann went in the opposite direction towards the Stettin station. And then? At the corner of Altmorbid, the Russian tanks came along, so I went back, and going back on that occasion, I saw on the Invaliden Bridge Bormann and Stumpfegger lying on their backs. I and the man who was with me stopped for a short moment at their bodies. I recognised their faces very clearly. Was it daylight? No, it was about 2:30 in the morning. That was the morning of May the 2nd? Of May the 2nd. It was not clear moonlight as Trevor Roper says in his book, but it was sufficiently light to be able to recognise their faces quite clearly. I talked to the man who was near me, but none of the two on the ground stirred. They showed no signs of life when we touched them, so that I had to come to the conclusion that they were dead. Just to add here, that there's always a temptation when listening to selected accounts such as this one to take them in isolation to suit a particular narrative. There is of course concern regarding reliability of accounts from a senior and lifelong Nazi, but context is key. Axmann's account actually runs to some 81 pages and covers much of the war. It does, however, have both the look and feel of a largely truthful one, and much of what he says in different points in the same account was then or has since been corroborated as accurate. The entire document is linked in the description, as are all the sources used in this video, so don't take our word for it, check it out for yourself and reach your own conclusions. On the whole, it's probable that Axmann, who like most senior party members was no great fan of Martin Bormann, gave his account truthfully as he saw it with regards to this episode. With that in mind, it would seem that Dr. Stumpfegger and Bormann's war came to an end right here, today in the middle of a busy road junction with no sign of what once took place. But with no bodies officially reported and neither man identified by the occupying Soviets, a mystery began to take shape. Rumours circulated that Bormann had escaped, living in Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, Austria and several other places at the same time, and often with positive sightings to accompany them. Such was the uncertainty that Bormann was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced, rightly so we might add, to death for crimes against humanity. So did he possibly escape? Well, no. But just how big of a story was Bormann's supposed disappearance? It was enormous. By turning to the vast archive of millions of pages of newspaper print from around the world available at Findmypast, we can get just a little hint of it. A search for Martin Bormann between 1950 and 1999 returns a staggering 1,400 results, ranging from the, on face value at least, plausible, to the downright absurd. We see here that in 1972 a Mr. Johannes Ehrmann, a German living in South America, was for some considerable time believed to be Bormann in exile. Along with several other potential Martin Bormanns in that part of the world, he was arrested but ultimately cleared when it was revealed he had emigrated in the 1920s. Of the many more outlandish claims was one Mrs. Nelson of Worthing in the UK, who said that Bormann had escaped to Britain in 1945, became engaged to Mrs. Nelson, fathered a daughter, and that, almost comically, their housekeeper was in fact Eva Braun, Hitler's wife, who too had escaped the bunker. Unsurprisingly, none of the hundreds of reported sightings ever identified Bormann, with all suspects being cleared. The passage of time supports Axmann's accounts of events in several very strong instances. First, when the postmaster at Lehrter station contacted the wife of Dr. Stumpfegger, explaining that employees of the station had found her husband by the Invalidenstrasse bridge and buried him nearby, he being identified by documents and photographs with the body. There is no way Axmann could have known this, and for Stumpfegger to be found in exactly the same spot he reported would have been an unbelievable coincidence given the size of Berlin and the scale of the fighting. Further, in 1963, 18 years after the two men disappeared, a retired postman, Albert Krumnow, reported to local police that he had buried several bodies on the 8th of May 1945, initiating a search. Excavations around Lehrter Bahnhof took place in 1965 and bore no results, but 7 years later, and just 12 metres from the previous search site, two bodies were found by chance during work to lay a cable near the old station. Those bodies, one significantly shorter in stature than the other, were forensically exhumed with detailed examinations carried out by leading academics. By comparing existing dental records, known pre-war injuries including a repaired collarbone break, facial reconstruction, and German scientists sending their findings off to the US for an independent opinion from a worldwide expert, it was confirmed that the smaller of the two skeletons was in fact that of Martin Bormann, who had never left this spot. Even to this day, rumours continue of post-war dental work being found on Bormann's teeth, unusual soil colouring of Bormann's skull, and even suggestions that Bormann's body had been recovered from South America to be discovered by construction workers, all of which don't stand up to even basic academic scrutiny. Finally, in 1999, mitochondrial DNA testing was undertaken, which once and for all confirmed that the shorter skeleton found here in December 1972 was that of Martin Bormann. In fact, during that chaotic escape from Berlin, very few of those attempting to flee actually avoided Soviet captivity, with most enduring years of hard labour in the far reaches of the Soviet Union. Amongst the few to avoid that fate were Erich Kempka, who was captured but later escaped, Hitler's secretaries Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian and Else Krüger, who had slipped away from Munker's group when they surrendered, dressed as Wehrmacht soldiers and guided by a Luftwaffe sergeant. They too reached the Elbe. And Arthur Axmann himself, who, after acquiring civilian clothing and with his wooden arm to aid his story, managed to pass as a civilian and eventually reached the American-controlled zone before being arrested in December 1945. Sentenced to 3 years in prison, Axmann went on to become a businessman after his release and was the last surviving senior Nazi when he died in October 1996, aged 93. Whilst the plight of those who tried to escape from the Führerbunker came to an end relatively quickly, the same can't be said for many citizens of occupied Berlin. Weeks of brutal reprisals for the horrors endured in the Eastern Front were meted out to men and women of all ages in the ashes of a city which at one time had been amongst the finest in Europe. Laying in those same ashes were the last charred remnants of a brutal ideology which indelibly scarred the 20th century and cost tens of millions of lives. That's all this time. We want to thank our sponsors for this episode, Findmypast, whose incredible archive of historic newspapers and vast online record sets offers an outstanding insight into the search for Martin Bormann. If you'd like to learn about your own family history, in war or peace, why not check out Findmypast at the link below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to try out other episodes right here on YouTube exploring the battle for Berlin. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.